For our panel discussion on Asian Pacific forest products markets, we've assembled a panel with a collective 130 years of industry experience, so it's a very impressive base, guys. It's my pleasure to introduce Bob Flynn, the Director of International Timber at RISI, Bryan Hayes, the CEO of Forico, Ian Tyson, the CEO of Timberlink Australia, and Nick O'Brien, the Director of Investment Analytics at New Forests. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for being here. Before we get started, the panel wanted to gauge your familiarity with forest products. If I could have a show of hands of people who've had physical contact with a forest product in the last 24 hours. For those that didn't raise their hands, I recommend a trip through to the bathrooms. There's some exceptional tissue product there that you should indulge yourself in. Excellent, gentlemen. Well, we obviously have a well-informed audience, and on this panel we hope to touch on what's been happening in forest products markets globally and in the Asia Pacific specifically over the last 5 years, what some of the current issues are, how that impacts on how we approach forest investments and forest valuations, and then look forward to the future of emerging products. We've touched on those already in some of the Q&A, and where we see wood products in the economy in the medium and long term. So Bob, I thought we'd start with you and tackle China, the elephant in the room. What's been happening there in the last 5 years, and should we be alert, alarmed, or in wild panic about slowing GDP growth in China?
Yeah, it's great to start with China because, as you mentioned, China has been the major driver of growth in demand for forest products for more than a decade. But over the last year, we've been inundated with this steady stream of negative news about the slowing economy, the collapse of the property market, and so on. So it would be very easy for investors to feel a bit panicked about what's going on. Very quickly, I'm going to look at just the short-term impacts and then the longer-term picture. So in the short term, the impact of China's market on your business depends on which products you're growing trees for, and it depends on where you've chosen to make those investments in growing trees. So let's start with the products. We've got the figures through the end of September. Year over year, imports of softwood logs are down about 18% this year in volume. Now keep in mind, last year was the all-time record peak in the softwood log market in Asia, in China, but that's a big drop. Hardwood logs haven't fared quite so badly, down about 10% this year. But if you look at the lumber markets, China's lumber imports are actually up slightly this year. And wood pulp, now you probably know China is the biggest market for importing wood pulp. Last year, again, was a record volume of wood pulp imports. Well, this year imports are up another 11% on top of that. And I'm going to leave wood chips to Bryan here, but I'll hint that that's also up quite a bit this year. Now, where are you growing timber? Let's take the worst market, the softwood log market this year. Those of you that have investments in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, where I live, you are painfully aware of how bad this market is, because shipments from that region to China are down more than 40%. If you've got radiata pine in New Zealand, the volume is down about 8%. But if you're growing pine in Australia, exporting some logs to China, as I think New Forest is doing, shipments from Australia are up 12%. So location matters. Now, short term versus longer term. Hopefully, if you're growing trees, you're not just looking at what's happened over the last 12 months. I track what I call China's timber and supply deficit, which is just their need to import wood fiber whether in the form of logs, lumber, pulp, whatever. So from 1998 through 2014, China's timber supply deficit increased at a compound annual rate of almost 14.5%. Now, if we could believe China's GDP statistics, they would say that over that same time period, their economy has been growing at about a 10% compound rate. So the point is that their need for imported wood fiber has been growing a whole lot faster than their economy, partly due to the fact that their domestic harvest has been trending lower over time. So how big is that deficit? This year it's going to be about 190 million cubic meters, which sounds impressive, but what that means is that 1 out of every 10 trees that is cut down anywhere in the world this year, 1 out of 10 is going to wind up going to China. So it's true that their growth rate in demand has slowed down, and it's, of course, a damn good thing it has, because if it continued growing at that rate, there will be nothing left for the rest of us. So China continues to be the world's biggest market. Their ability to grow their own fiber has not improved. It's actually diminished. They're going to continue to be a great market for forest products.
Thank you. I'm calmer now than I was at the start, Bob. So, Bryan, Forico is a significant producer and supplier of hardwood fibre. How has that market changed in the last 5 years?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, look, we've seen the China phenomenon, the China story as well. I should have finished that cup of tea. And certainly, I mean, when I first started going to Japan probably 25 years ago, Japan was the only show in town when it came to woodchip exports, hardwood woodchip exports. That changed probably 10 years ago, a little more. There was some interest coming out of China, but the big story has been China, and it will continue to be for some time to come, I believe, in terms of ocean-traded wood chips, wood fibre. Mainly because what we're seeing is that the pulp and paper sector is also changing. The one constant up there is change, but we're seeing products like tissue and toweling for hygiene and sanitary purposes, which you referred to earlier, so it's a very nice segue, Matt, thank you, growing exponentially. And we know that in the decade we're currently in up to about 2017, they will treble or 300% increase in the amount of tissue manufacture capacity they have in Asia. And what causes that and what drives that, what we're seeing is that what was sometimes considered a luxury good in terms of tissue and sanitary products becomes a staple good, and suddenly the whole of the population needs it. And when you've got the population that they do, that's what drives some of that investment. But I mean, still conventional printing and writing papers. Newsprint, of course, is out of fashion these days, so that's changed a lot. Packaging materials has also changed a lot, but is still a significant part of the industries across Asia. But we're certainly seeing change, most of it being the big growth in China, and starting to see signs that India may also emerge as a big buyer into the future.
So, Bryan, in terms of the supply mix into those markets over the last 5 years, you look back 5 years, supply was dominated by Australia, South Africa, Chile. How has that changed to current day?
I think the standout star there was probably Vietnam. We didn't appreciate that Vietnam could do quite what it did. I won't throw absolute numbers around, but they certainly increased up to become the largest hardwood woodchip fibre supplier into Japan and to China. The dynamics have changed because of currency and other movements domestically in places like Chile and South Africa. Australia is still an important supplier, and fortunately at the moment with exchange rates moving in our favour, we're seeing Australia getting back some of our market share. But Vietnam was the big surprise. I guess over the 5 years it just kept growing and growing and growing. Everybody was saying this is not sustainable, it's going to have to hit the wall sooner or later. It didn't, but there are signs now that it might be slowing and actually diminishing to some extent.
Thanks, Bryan. Bob, from your helicopter view, how have you seen Southeast Asia and Vietnam in particular emerge? Is that something that you saw coming? Has it surprised you, as Bryan mentioned?
Yeah, it has surprised me, and it gets to a point I was going to bring up later about the importance of smallholder forestry. I used to be very dismissive of this as something that was nice for governments and NGOs to talk about working with the little farmers to grow trees. But I thought, it's really only the industrial forest that matters. Well, I was way off. In countries like India, like Vietnam, like Thailand, where you've got millions of farmers happily growing trees for the industry, and you can see the impact on their income and what it means to them. They're quite happy with this market, and it did surprise me, I have to admit, but it's been a pretty strong force.
And more to come, or do you think that market is now maxed in terms of its supply capability?
Well, that's one of those long questions, but because many of you may know that the Vietnamese government wants to see more of that wood processed internally to create more value adding in the country. And they've come out with some very clear policies, stating that they want to basically cut this volume in half. Now, if they did that, there would be a huge hole in the market. But we don't think that's going to happen in the short term. But certainly, the expansion has probably ended. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Ian, I was going to turn to you and switch markets a little bit, talk about domestic lumber and some of the market cycles we've seen in lumber demand in Australia and New Zealand in the last 5 years. Can you give us a sense of what's been happening there?
Sure. The softwood market is essentially driven by detached housing. I think most people would realise that that's where the majority of Australian-grown softwood, and to some extent in New Zealand it's the same, not quite as reliant, a little bit more export focused. But more than 50% of the softwood timber that's consumed and produced in Australia goes into that market. It's a highly cyclical market. It's one that's often in the paper, and it's a political ball that gets thrown around from policy to policy. What we've seen, though, is some very different dynamics within the way that people live, and you only have to look around you here to understand that the sort of re-urbanisation of society and the infill strategies within major cities is having a major effect in terms of what the demand cycle looks like for the industry. Having said that, though, the last several years we have seen very strong demand in detached housing, so it's been a good cycle that we've been in. New Zealand has seen that as well, having come off a much greater dip in terms of their demand right through from 2003 almost to about 2009. New Zealand has had the benefit of the earthquake within Christchurch. There's a significant rebuild program, and there's a lot of underlying demand within Auckland and surrounding regions. So New Zealand's been quite a strong market. Australia, however, has been quite different, and the southern states within the country over the last 4 to 5 years have been very strong. WA benefited from the mining boom, a lot of people moving into that market requiring housing, so that really drove that market very strongly. The Victorian market had very strong population drift and was an immigration centre. You could buy a house and land in Melbourne, not too far out of the city, 15, 20 k's out of the corridor, for 300,000 to 400,000. Not achievable in the New South Wales market. But the pent-up demand within this market has been enormous within the Sydney market and its major corridor feeding markets. And we've now seen that get unlocked in the last couple of years. I think some positive state government policy, the right economic conditions has really seen this market start to take off, and some of the southern markets starting to just slightly cool. So what Australia is a collection of markets. You have to look at each particular state, and then there are regional stories within it, and then of course there are influences on things like currency, international markets. Our favourite saying at the moment is Australia's no longer an island. It might just look like one, but we're part of a global traded community, and we see a lot of penetration from imports, a lot of competition, and so you just can't look at the demand cycle to understand the supply cycle. You actually have to look more broadly to build a picture, but generally positive.
Thanks, Ian. So So you're talking about imports coming into the country. Can I get you to talk a little bit about how that's changed in the last 5 years? Where have we seen imports coming from? What's driving that?
Well, I suppose if you go back in time, Australia's always been an importer of timber, so it's not a new position for us as a country. However, as the plantation estates matured and the capabilities of softwood sawmilling improved in Australia, then we became a lot less reliant. However, being part of a global community, we've seen particularly European wood gain strong penetration in this market. We've seen companies put distribution centres and put capability in place, which is a commitment to the market. And then we see the byproduct of international trading where people hunt for a period of time and then disappear for a period of time, and they use this as a traded market. So about 20% of our softwood demand is now met by imported product. That's a little high for my liking, and some of that's on a basis where they're just hunting our market for volume, and it's a better option than somewhere else, and that will ebb and flow. And some of it's about a long-term commitment that you can expect that wood will still flow into this market, given the right economic conditions prevailing.
Right, thank you. So Nick, we've heard about market cycles and things changing over a 5-year period. Part of your task is looking out 50, 100 years into the future and trying to forecast asset prices. How the hell do you do that?
Well, and we've got the old Dutch saying that trying to make predictions is very difficult, especially about the future. And certainly looking out a long period of time is something that we do on a regular basis. Obviously, the historical information we have around markets and the pricing within those markets is a very important data set that we use looking forward, but past performance is not always a predictor of future performance, as they say. And so I think there's a number of key things that we use within our framework for trying to predict what may happen in the future. And one of those is to really understand the key market drivers for any particular product. And so not just looking at the Australian dollar at wharfgate price for a hardwood chip, and we're looking at, okay, what's influencing that? It's FX, it's freight, and more importantly, it's what price are we getting in the market in China or Japan, and what's influencing those prices. In the case of pulpwood, it's really the international pulp price on the market that's driving what people are willing to pay for our chips, and we bring that right back through into our pricing for our assets. I think another important component for us, and Bob, you touched on this, is taking a long-term view. It's not just get focused on the short-term volatility, and we've seen, particularly for softwood log prices in Australia and New Zealand, we see a lot of volatility based around what's happening in China with the amount of wood sitting in inventory on port, and so where we see our log prices come off 25-30%, we're not going, oh, holy cow, that's permanent, it's going to happen forever, and we really need to make a drastic change to our valuations or our bid models based on that. And we try and take a longer term view around some sort of stable price, and obviously we need to take into account the short term fluctuations. But if we don't do that, then we risk overpaying for assets at certain times and not being competitive at other times. And so we need to try and make sure that we are taking into account any variability that's happening, but having some stability over the longer term. But at the same time, I think it's important that we recognise that there are disruptive technologies and there are disruptive market trends happening that will lead to changes in markets compared to what we've seen historically. And I think it's very important for us to try and recognise those as soon as possible, but not jump onto a bandwagon too early that we make a poor decision, but not ignore the situation for too long that we've really missed the boat. And so I think there's a middle ground that we need to tread quite carefully there. But in a lot of our work, we're making an assessment about something that is really unknowable in the future, and so one of the key things that we need to do is test sensitivity around our assumptions so that we know within our models what are the key drivers of value, and therefore what are the things that we really need to focus on in terms of the supporting information for the assumptions that we're putting into our models. And that's really where we need to focus our time, rather than, and there might be other variables that we can spend a lot of time on, but they really don't turn the dial. So, and we can ignore them to some degree.
Thanks, Nick. As I understand it, traditionally we've not incorporated future estimates of improvements of wood properties in our forward projections. A lot of the work we're doing through the supply chain in any forestry business is looking at how we improve fibre yield or how we improve wood stiffness. Can I get you to talk about how the hell we incorporate that into our projections?
There's a very strong data set for historical improvements in genetics, and that's comes through in our just simple productivity, so how many cubic metres per hectare per year are we getting, but also where we can drive the improvement of wood products to provide a higher density log that then goes into a sawmill that can recover a greater volume of structural timber. And I think one of the advantages that we have, particularly here in Australia, is that we do have quite a good integration with our processing side of things. And so we're working very closely with Timberlink to make sure that where there are gains to be had, we can capture the benefit of those gains for the benefit of our overall investments. Some of that gain will be had at the mill, some of it will be had in the forest, and making sure that it comes down to our sensitivity analysis. One of the things that we're doing is trying to look at, over the longer term, how much of our value proposition is driven from a change in wood stiffness versus a change in pulp yield versus other components, and look at what each of those drivers mean from a point of view of value today, and really focus on which can we change and how much can we change it by. Let's focus on those ones.
Thanks, Nick. So I wanted to lift the gaze now a little bit into the future and get a sense from the panel as to what we see as the emerging trends in the market. We've heard earlier about the emergence of the bioeconomy and some biomaterials. Bob, can I start with you by talking about where you see the big changes in fibre flows and demand globally and in the Asia Pacific over the next 10, 20 years?
Well, I'm also enthusiastic about a number of the new products that David mentioned, but I'll leave that to some of the other panelists. What I'm excited about is the new markets that we're really not talking much about yet. India is not going to be an explosive growth story like China has been, but it's going to be a very good growth market for a very, very long time, because there's absolutely no way they can produce enough wood for what they're going to need. Africa is a location that we seldom ever talk about at these conferences, and again, it's going to be exciting. Over the next 15 years, their demand for wood product imports is going to reach like $100 billion, something like that. The investors that are establishing plantations in Africa are not growing wood for Asia Pacific. They're growing wood for the African market. So I guess that's some of the things that I would look at as some of these new markets that we're not really even on the radar yet.
That's great, thank you. So Ian, in Australia and New Zealand, how do you see us positioned to access some of that emerging demand in the Asia Pacific? Is sawn timber going to start being redirected to export markets from domestic?
Yeah, well, I certainly think that Australia and New Zealand need to understand they're part of an Asian region. I think New Zealand understands it better than Australia sometimes, certainly from a wood products point of view. Asia for Australian producers has been where our low grade and our chips and our lower value product within the industry is generally gone, and I think we've just got to completely change our thinking. But to do that, you have to have highly competitive mills, you have to chase the right amount of value, you have to invest the right amount of capital, You have to have an outward focus. You have to recognise you're part of a global community, and so there's a lot of things that you have to do to get there, rather than just sort of arrive on the doorstep of a customer in China or India or somewhere and learn the hard way. So there's a series of things. I think we're incredibly well positioned to do that. I think us as a business is particularly well positioned because I think the integration model that we have from forest through to processing really does enable us to view how we capitalise on those things in an integrated way. So sawing timber for external use in international markets out of Australia and New Zealand, I think has lots and lots of potential. But where we're at the moment, and I think a lot of Australian manufacturing is get its cost position down, get its efficiencies up, so it can make the margin, it can trade against anyone in the marketplace, and then start to look at not just sawn timber, but actually systems and solutions and panelised construction and new markets and new opportunities, and all those things kind of start to leverage off each other. And in 10 years' time, what you actually have is a very different looking industry that's not talking about what's happening in the housing cycle. You're actually looking more broadly about what's happening within the region, what's happening across the whole spectrum of markets and building system opportunities, and our customers that can be different, and the way we actually do things can be quite different. So I think the next 10 years in this industry is incredibly exciting.
Thank you, Andy. Bryan, in fibre markets, is it ultimately about biomaterials rather than traditional pulp and paper markets? How do you see that emerging?
I think we're certainly seeing that trend starting to happen, but I don't think it's going to be absolute one or the other. I think there's always going to be a place for the foreseeable future for conventional pulp and paper products, but we are seeing the emergence of new technologies, and we know that the fundamental things that people need, food for instance, that there are a lot of wood-based products that can now be made that can assist in the storage of food and the handling of food. Such properties that are antibacterial, antiviral, antifungal type properties that can be developed from cellulose fibre. So we're seeing those sort of biotechnologies emerging, and I think in terms of entering the bio era, if I could pinch from a commentator somewhere, I recall him saying that history will say that the 19th century was the century of iron, the 20th century was the century of concrete, and the 21st century will be the century of wood. Now, unravelling that a little bit, it doesn't mean that we're all going to live in wood houses and suddenly these skyscrapers that you see behind us will be replaced by wooden structures, but what they're saying is that this is the start of the bio era. There are so many fantastic products that are being discovered or are known about already that wood fibre can be used for, and I believe that we are entering that phase. And more sophisticated technology such as nanotechnology, who knows where it's going to go. There are breakthroughs happening almost on a daily basis. If they can be commercialised for the benefit of humanity, and we all know that trees and wood fibre is a very sustainable, renewable source of fibre for a multitude of products, and I believe that's the bio era that we're entering. Yes.
Great, Bryan. Oh, that's a really nice way to wrap up the panel discussion, I think. Please thank our panellists. Insightful commentary, guys.